draft history, you don't hold no value to your picks anyway. You're the Lakers. You have made your greatness through trades. You're trading for Shaquille O'Neal. You're trading for
It's so easy to become a podcaster with Riverside. You just need a concept and a way to record it. Here's how it works. First, go to riverside.fm and open an account, and then you'll be able to capture high-quality video and audio from practice.
You say you are more... be obligated to do remarkable things. Why?
Well, I think partly because life is so difficult and challenging that unless you get
Be obligated to do... You say you are more... Why?
Well, I think partly because life is so difficult.
Yo, mic check, mic check.
You say you are more... Why?
Well, I think partly because life is so difficult.
Yo, mic check, mic check.
Everything you have, the chances are very high that it will embitter you, and then you'll be a force for darkness and not good. And so, you know, the fact that life is short and can be brutal can terrify you into hiding and avoiding, but it can also, you can flip that on its head and understand that since you're all in anyways, you might as well take the risks that are adventurous. And that's a very good thing to understand. And what is also useful to understand in that manner is that there isn't anything more adventurous than the truth. This is something that took me a long time to figure out. Well, you can craft your words to get what you want, you know, and people do that all the time. They craft their words so they can avoid taking responsibility for things they should take responsibility for, or they can craft their words to gain an advantage that they really don't deserve. That's what you do when you manipulate. And the problem with that, you might say, well, why not do that if I can get what I want? And the answer to that is, you aren't necessarily the best judge of what you need. And it's easy to be deluded in what you want. And that's the sort of delusions that people chase if they chase power. If you decide instead that you're going to just say what you believe to be true, you have to let go of the consequences. And you might think, well, I don't want to let go of the consequences because I want to control what's going on. But what you miss then is adventure, because if you don't control what's going on, you don't know what the hell's going to happen. And maybe that's exciting. And actually, there's no doubt about it. And then you have the additional advantage if you're attempting to say what you believe to be true and attempting to act in the manner that you think is most appropriate. That's genuinely you, and you have the force of reality behind you. Obviously, that's what you have if you're trying to, say, live in the truth, is you have the force of reality behind you. That seems like a good deal. Then you have the reality and the adventure. So why is that a moral obligation? Well, if you hide and you don't let what's inside of you out, and you don't bring into the world what you could bring, and you become cynical and bitter, you will start doing very dark things. So you'll start, not only will you not add to the world what you could add, but you'll start being jealous of people who are competent and doing well and work to destroy them. So that's the pathway to hell, really. So
one of the trends that I've been railing against most
happen. And maybe that's exciting. And actually, there's no doubt about it. And then you have the additional advantage if you're attempting to say what you believe to be true and attempting to act in the manner that you think is most appropriate. That's genuinely you, and you have the force of reality behind you. And obviously, that's what you have if you're trying to, say, live in the truth, is you have the force of reality behind you. That seems like a good deal. Then you have the reality and the adventure. So why is that a moral obligation? Well, if you hide and you don't let what's inside of you out, and you don't bring into the world what you could bring, and you become cynical and bitter, you will start doing very dark things. So you'll start, not only will you not add to the world what you could add, but you'll start being jealous of people who are competent and doing well and work to destroy them. Then you have the reality and the adventure. So why is that a moral obligation? Well, if you hide and you don't let what's inside of you out, and you don't bring into the world what you could hide, so why is that seems like a good deal. Then you have the reality and the adventure. So why is that a moral obligation? Well, if you hide and you don't let what's inside of you out, and you don't bring into the world what you could bring, and you become cynical and bitter, you will start doing very dark things. So you'll start, not only will you not add to the world what you could add, but you'll start being jealous of people who are competent and doing well and work to destroy them. So that's the pathway to hell, really. So
one of the trends that I've been railing against most recently has been cynicism. There's this pervasive belief that everything is terrible and it can't get better.
Yeah.
And the people who believe that it can improve are dumb and delusional
Yeah.
and the problem. And I don't know where it comes from. I don't
well,
like
it's
it.
the beginning of wisdom, cynicism. This is part of the reason why it's hard to combat. Because people start out naive. And naive people are optimistic. But not really. They're just naive. And naive people have no idea that there's, say, malevolence in the world. They have no idea that there's malevolence in their own heart. They're sheltered and dependent. And when that breaks, it often breaks into cynicism. And so cynicism is actually an improvement.
As the veils have fallen from your eyes.
Exactly. The problem with cynicism is that, especially if it's allied with a kind of arrogance, is that you can end there. And that's a big mistake. So then the question becomes, well, once you've been bitten hard and you're no longer naive, well, that is very hard on your optimism, let's say. So then the question is, how do you restore that without reverting to the naivety, which you can't do anyways without blinding yourself once you've been bitten? And the answer to that is you substitute courage for naivety, and you regain your optimism as a moral imperative, right? So one of the things you might ask yourself is, well, if the future is likely to be catastrophic in a variety of different ways, which is definitely the case, both socially and personally, then what attitude should you bring to bear on that? And the answer might be, well, if you were courageous and faithful, and I can explain what that means, then you would conduct yourself in a manner that met the future head on, with the presumption that you can manage it. And this is the presumption we should bring to bear politically. Now, the people who are using fear to garner power point to the various apocalypses that might befall us. And it's difficult to counter them because the future is always an apocalyptic horizon. Like everything can fall apart and has before and might well again and will, in fact, in your life as you age and die. And so it's very easy to conjure up an apocalypse. Then the question becomes not, is that apocalypse potentially real? Because the answer to that is yes, but what attitude should you have towards that? Naive, that's not good. Cynical, that's better, but it's still not good. It's another form of hell, and it also tends to make the potential apocalypses more likely. Well, so what do you have when you move beyond cynicism? And what you have when you move beyond cynicism is wisdom. And that's not naive, it's courageous. And one of the things that religious people have done relatively badly, especially in recent years, is they've failed to delineate the relationship between faith and courage. You know, people like Dawkins and the New Atheists, they point to faith and they describe it as something like belief in foolish superstitions. But that isn't really what faith in the deepest sense means. It means that you are willing to act out the proposition that you can ride the wave no matter how big it becomes. And that we can all do that together, especially if we do that in goodwill. And I think that's a much more appropriate way to confront the future. And it's also the proper medication for cynicism. Now, the other thing about cynicism that's interesting too is that cynics aren't cynical enough about their own cynicism, right? Because you can get doubtful enough to start doubting the validity of your own cynicism. It's like, what makes you so smart? What makes you the judge of being? You know, the Columbine kids were like that. You know, they decided that existence itself was unsustainable given its cruelty, and that the proper response was to put up a giant middle finger to men and God, right? Well, here's a way of being cynical about cynicism. How does your cynicism let you off the hook, right? How does your cynicism justify your desire to avoid necessary responsibility and to pursue your own short-term hedonic gains? It's like, why aren't you cynical about your own doubt? And that's another place where wisdom begins. It's like, so that's two, right? Cynicism beats naivety, but it's not the ultimate destination. And you should be cynical enough to question the moral validity of your own resentment and your own, what would you say, your own turning away from the world.
The way that I see it, given that we don't know the future, given that much of our motivations are invisible to us,
this game, you're not ready for it.
we're not a crystal pond that we can see into. You have to have some form of delusion about what's going to happen in the future. You're trying your best to see the way that it's going to be, but given that the glass could be half empty or half full, why not have a delusion that's going to be useful to you, one of hope, even in the face and the understanding that things might be difficult and that there's going to be obstacles?
You know, there was a line of social psychology that pursued that argument for quite a while, that made the argument that people had to have positive illusions about the future, and that was the fundamental way that people staved off despair and bolstered their self-esteem. But I don't think we need to separate out the distinction between fantasy and delusion. You do have a fantasy about the future. You have to, because like you said, it's not structured. So you have to provisionally map the future. That's what a plan is.
Positive
That's
goal.
what a strategy is.
Yeah.
Right. But that doesn't make it a delusion. Like, it becomes a delusion when the map bears no relationship to the underlying territory. So if you have a strategy for the future, maybe let's say that your strategy for the future, just for the sake of argument, is that you have 5 million YouTube subscribers in 3 years. Well, you have no evidence of the strict sort that that's how it's going to be, because anything could happen between now and 3 years from now, let's say. But there's no reason to call that a delusion. It's one hypothetically possible path of potential. And then you can make the sacrifices necessary to bring that about. So No, it's a fantasy because it maps something that isn't there. It's not a delusion. It's a delusion when you're ignoring elements of your own experience that would inform your fantasy more effectively. You're ignoring them so that you can live in a positive representation of the future without having to pay the appropriate price for it.
One of my favorite ideas I learned over the last couple of years is the inner citadel from Isaiah Berlin. Do you know this? So Isaiah Berlin says, when the natural road toward human fulfillment is blocked, human beings retreat into themselves, become involved in themselves, and try to create inwardly that world which some evil fate
Right.
has denied them
Yeah.
externally.
That's a delusion often.
If you cannot obtain from the world that which you really desire, you must teach yourself not to want it. If you cannot get what you want, you must teach yourself to want what you can get. This is a very frequent form of spiritual retreat in depth into a kind of inner citadel in which you lock yourself up against all of the fearful ills of the world. Mutual friend Rob Henderson explained it in a simpler way. If your leg is wounded, you can try to treat the leg. And if you can't, then you cut the leg off and denounce that the desire for legs is misguided and must be subdued. And I think that we see this everywhere.
Well, okay, so imagine that you lay out a plan and it meets with an impediment and it knocks the slats out from underneath the plan. Okay, now you retreat. Okay, now you have an option when you're retreating, and one option is to construct a world in fantasy where you're taking revenge on those who wronged you and getting what you want. That's a pathway to madness. So often people who develop serious delusions do develop what would you call them? They're compensatory fantasies, and then they start to dwell in them, and often for hundreds of hours. So the kids, again, who showed up to Columbine High School, they dwelt in a fantasy world for hundreds of hours before they undertook their dreadful actions, right? But you can also flip back into yourself, let's say, and you can, this is like confession and atonement. It's the proper way to think about it, is you can think about what it is that you did wrong or insufficiently that led to the collapse of your plan, right? So that's the first investigation. I made some sacrifices. I attempted to bring about a particular form of the future. It didn't happen. Okay, why? Well, the world is set against me and the cosmos is evil and there's no God and I'm bitter and cynical. That's one potential explanation, right? Poor me, right? And I'm not trying to be flippant about this because sometimes people's dreams are quite realistic and they still fail catastrophically. You know, it can be brutal. You know, maybe you did make a lot of good decisions and you suddenly got ill, or someone in your family did, and everything went to hell on you. It doesn't have to be because you've done something cardinally foolish that you fail. You know, it's built into the structure of the world. But it doesn't matter. You can also retreat into yourself and you can say something like, all right, I need to retool my conception of strategy, but also potentially my conception of goal. You know, maybe I'm looking in the wrong place. Maybe I have to look somewhere else. And you can open yourself up to a revelation. So there's a gospel statement that's very relevant to this. So Christ tells his followers that if they knock, the door will open. If they ask, they'll receive. And if they seek, they'll find. And so it sounds magical. It sounds like the sort of thing that the new atheists would have a field day with. But that's not a wise interpretation of that saying. The proper interpretation is something more like a recognition of the way thought works. So imagine your plans didn't work out. Okay, now you sit, my conception of goal, you know, maybe so there's a gospel statement that's somewhere else, and you can open yourself up to a revelation. So there's a gospel statement that's very relevant to this. So Christ tells his followers that if they knock, the door will open. If they ask, they'll receive, and if they seek, they'll find. And so it sounds magical. It sounds like the sort of thing that the new atheists would have a field day with, but that's not a wise interpretation of that saying. The proper interpretation is something more like a recognition of the way thought works. So imagine your plans didn't work out. Okay, now you sit down and you say to yourself, I'd like to know, even if the world was conspiring against me and my failure was 95% the fault of external occurrences and other people, what did I do that wasn't as good as it could have been, and where did I fail to look so that the probability of my failure was higher? Now, to ask that question, you have to want the answer. That's what it means to knock or to ask or to seek. This is no joke. It's like you have to want to know. And it's a very painful thing to do because especially if you had given it your all to the degree you were able and you have reason to be bitter, you're going to be searching for the errors that you still made. And discovering your own errors is always extremely painful, right? Especially if they're errors that you're in love with. And so you have to be willing to strip yourself down. That's what humility means fundamentally. And then, but the advantage is, this is why it's so useful to listen to people. You might find out where you're stupid. And then you could stop being stupid. And so one of the reasons you confess your sins, let's say, is because you want to discover where you're insufficient. Now, it's painful. It's painful to encounter an impediment in the form of someone else's opinion that might show you where you're blind and ignorant, or willfully blind even. But the advantage to that is you can rectify the error, and then as you move forward, you're stronger. One of the things I taught my kids, and I hope at least somewhat successfully, was that you should always ask a stupid question. And that doesn't mean the sort of question that someone who wasn't paying attention would ask. If you're listening to someone and you don't understand what they're saying, and you reveal that, you're revealing your ignorance, and maybe you're in a room full of people and you think you're the only person stupid enough to not get it, which is very rarely the case, by the way. The thing is, though, if you reveal that ignorance to yourself and to the other person, they can rectify it. And if you do that 1,000 times, you're not ignorant anymore. And this is a real pathway to success, too. You see it, you do this because you ask real questions in your podcast. And Rogan does this. Okay, Rogan's always trying to be a little smarter than he already is. And then that works, iterated. Like if you ask 1,000 dumb questions and you listen to the answer, then you know 1,000 things, some of them deep, that you didn't know before. So that's the advantage to searching your soul, let's say, for unrequited sins and attempting to atone. That's not a delusion, right? It's an attempt to set yourself right. It's the opposite of a delusion, even though there can be a fantastical element to it.
Yeah, the conversation around people who try their best, do as many things right as they could, and yet still fall short because the world is random and unfortunate things happen. Happiness, as far as I can see it, sits in the gap between your expectations and reality. But the problem here is that people who have high standards often end up feeling a lack, right? How can people who strive like this avoid feeling despondent at falling short of their own high standards? I've heard you talk about the statue of David saying something like, "You are not all that you could be."
Yeah.
And as soon as you posit an ideal, you begin to compare yourself to that ideal.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's a good question. I mean, the ultimate ideal is also the ultimate judge, because the ultimate ideal is something against which you fall far short. And that might be so painful that you can barely stand it. But then what you do is you two things, I suppose, is you lower the ideal and you raise your estimation of your potential. And what do I mean by lower the ideal? Well, if you're comparing yourself to someone or even to a future self, and the gap is so painful that it paralyzes you, then you've created a dragon that you don't have the tools to master. And so what you have to do is you have to scale the dragon down to size. And you want to scale the dragon down to size until it's a size that you are willing to move toward, however small that is. Now, if you're here and your ideal is here and that gap is unbearable, then you reduce the gap and you reduce the gap. And you're going to have to do that anyways, because you're not going to move from where you are to perfect in one fell swoop, right? There's going to be incremental steps. So you have to fill in that hierarchy of you don't have the tools to master, or the ideal. Well, if you're comparing yourself, and what do I mean by lower the ideal? Then, and the gap is so to someone or even to a future self, and the gap is so painful that it paralyzes you, then you've created a dragon that you don't have the tools to master. And so what you have to do is you have to scale the dragon down to size. And you want to scale the dragon down to size until it's a size that you are willing to move toward, however small that is. Now, if you're here and your ideal is here and that gap is unbearable, then you reduce the gap and you reduce the gap. And you're going to have to do that anyways, because you're not going to move from where you are to perfect in one fell swoop, right? There's going to be incremental steps. So you have to fill in that hierarchy of progression with a high enough resolution representation so that you can start to move forward. And then you should be buttressed. There's another gospel comment that's very interesting. It has to do, it's called the Matthew principle. And the Matthew principle is, to those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. Now, it's brutal because it implies that reality works like this. When you're moving up, you go like this, right? And that's pretty nice. That's a lot better than this. But when you're going down, you go like that, right? It's like downhill, downhill, cliff. Okay, so you want to avoid the downhill path. Well, if the uphill path is like this, which is like exponential, let's say, or geometric, then what that means is that...
So what is ClickUp? ClickUp is an all-in-one productivity software where you can manage everything and anything related to your work. Your doc...
It doesn't matter path. Is, to those who have everything, more will be given. And you should be buttressed. There's another gospel comment that's very interesting. It has to do, it's called the Matthew principle. And the Matthew principle, there's another gospel comment. You can start to move forward. And then you should be buttressed. There's another gospel comment that's very interesting. It has to do, it's called the Matthew principle. And the Matthew principle is, to those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. Now, it's brutal because it implies that reality works like this. When you're moving up, you go like this, right? And that's pretty nice. That's a lot better than this. But when you're going down, you go like that, right? It's like downhill, downhill, cliff. Okay, so you want to avoid the downhill path. Well, if the uphill path is like this, which is like exponential, let's say, or geometric, then what that means is that it doesn't matter how big the first steps you take uphill are, even if they're trivial, even if they're shameful in their size, because you're so useless, that if you're disciplined in that, you'll speed up extraordinarily rapidly. And so that's the good news, you might say, is that you can take very small steps, even ones that might be shameful in their size, and you have to admit that to yourself, but once you get the ball rolling, it doesn't roll in a linear fashion, it rolls in a geometric fashion. And this is a really good thing to know because it can take the sting out of the realization of your own stupidity. It's like, yeah, everybody has their weak sides, let's say, things they're embarrassed about. When I first started going to the gym, I was like, how old was I? 1985, 23. And I think I weighed 135 pounds and I was 6'1", very, very thin. A 27-inch waist, something like that. And I smoked like mad and I drank too much. Like I wasn't in good shape. The first attempts forward I took in the gym, I went to this swimsercise class. Jesus, it was me and this like really fat guy, young guy, probably not in any worse shape than me, and like 7 old women, over 70, and they could outswim me. Like it was pretty damn humiliating. And so I did a semester of that and got myself in somewhat better shape. And then I started to go to the gym to work out, to lift weights. And that was also rough because, I'd be underneath the bloody bench press trying to lift 75 pounds off the rests. And, some muscle-headed bastard would come over and tell me how to do it. And it's like, yeah, thank you. But it's embarrassing, and lots of times people won't do things like go to the gym because they're so embarrassed about how they look or what sort of shape they're in. And it's a pain to start at the bottom, but you start at the bottom where you're weak. And if you want to rectify what's weak, you have to accept the fact that you're at the bottom and that the first steps are going to be painful. It took me about 3 years, but I stopped smoking and then I stopped drinking and I gained 40 pounds of muscle in like 3.5 years, something like that. I basically had to stop doing that because I had to eat like 6 times a day. It was crazy. But I got a lot more physically confident and a lot more coordinated, because working out with dumbbells makes you coordinated, right? Because it exercises all the small ligaments and the tendons. And so my lower body in particular got a lot more coordinated. Then I could dance, so that was better when I was going out dancing, because I did a lot of that in graduate school. But the point of all this is, if you're going to rectify your weaknesses, you have to admit your insufficiency to your own shame. Now, if the gap between you and your ideal is so great that it paralyzes, rectify your weaknesses, you have to the point of all this is, if you're going to rectify your weaknesses, you have to admit. The point of all this is, if you're going to dancing, because I did a lot of that in graduate school, but the point of all this is, if you're going to rectify your weaknesses, you have to admit your insufficiency to your own shame. Now, if the gap between you and your ideal is so great that it paralyzes you, you shrink that, right?
We'll get back to talking to Jordan in 1 minute, but first I need to tell you about Maui Nui venison. Maui Nui venison is the most protein-dense and nutrient-dense red meat. But that's not your comparison group. If you have the impetus to sit down and listen to me and you waffle on for 3 hours about these deep topics, these interesting ideas, you are so already selected out of the normal group. You're already asking yourself questions that
The right questions.
almost nobody else is, right? But because your comparison group are people that are unbelievably high performing. I remember before I started my podcast, I'd listen to you or to Sam or to Joe, and I'd think, God, their recall is amazing. It's like they've just got this eidetic memory, and everything that they've ever read is able to come to the surface, and they're able to say it in this way that's completely seamless and all the rest of it. You go, okay, well, are you really a person that's never recorded a podcast before going to compare yourself to Joe Rogan, man that's recorded 1,000 and spent 10,000 hours on stage and done all of this UFC commentary and done all of this stuff in terms of TV? Is that really who you're going to compare yourself to? And it's unfair. And the problem that I see is, people who have big dreams for themselves and want to do great things, they like to set their sights high.
Yeah.
And yet they feel despondent in the comparison.
Yeah.
So I think
Well, there's a pride in that too, eh?
I can be. I want to be.
Well, or that's who I should be comparing myself to, right? That's the pride. And the pride is something like, I should be that, or even I could be that. It's like, well, maybe you could, but you're certainly not going to do it, as you already pointed out, without the apprenticeship. Right, so you could say that the despondency is actually is in proportion to the false pride. Now, I wrote a chapter in, I think, my first book, which was compare yourself to who you are today, not to who someone else is. I mangled that to some degree, but you get the point. The proper comparison group for you is you yesterday, because you can make. First of all, you're the only control group that's appropriate to you, because you have a certain set of talents and possibilities and limitations and tragedies that are truly unique to you. And so you might be comparing yourself to someone else on some dimension, but it's not a reasonable comparison, because you don't know what talents they were blessed with, and you also don't know what opportunities they had that you didn't, etc. It's just not a reasonable comparison. It's a lot better to think about who you were and then to think, well, could you be somewhat better in some dimension? And the positive thing about that is the answer is better yesterday. Point. The proper comparison group for you is you yesterday. You get the point. The proper comparison group for you is you yesterday. Because you can make, first of all, you're the only control group that's appropriate to you, because you have a certain set of talents and possibilities and limitations and tragedies that are truly unique to you. And so you might be comparing yourself to someone else on some dimension, but it's not a reasonable comparison, because you don't know what talents they were blessed with, and you also don't know what opportunities they had that you didn't, etc. It's just not a reasonable comparison. It's a lot better to think about who you were and then to think, well, could you be somewhat better in some dimension? And the positive thing about that is the answer is almost always yes. Now, you can orient that transformation towards some stellar target, and that's a reasonable thing to do, but
this one curl is the reason I started my wavy hair journey. When I found Prose, I was desperate for a solution for my frizzy waves.
that doesn't exactly mean that you should compare yourself to that target. Aiming at something and comparing yourself to it are not exactly the same thing. Plus, your bloody comparison is also a delusion. You know, that's another thing that you have to understand, is that you look at the person you're jealous of, and really what you're doing is you're looking through a very narrow aperture at a very thin slice of their life. You're looking at the thin slice of their life that's turning out the best, but you're also looking at a thin slice of their life that's marketed to be the best, right? And you have no idea what the horror of that person's life might be in its totality. And you have no idea if the deal was, say you wanted to be Russell Brand. There's a good example. You wanted to be Russell Brand. You wanted to be as charismatic and as famous as he is. Well, your real wish is that you get to have everything Russell Brand has, but none of his problems. Well, come on. I mean, it's no wonder that a vision like that would make you despondent, because it's naive, it's resentful, it's jealous, it's bitter, and it's unreasonable. You have to take the good with the bad. You have to take the bad with the good. And people rarely think about that when they're thinking about, the famous people they think they'd like to be.
There was a recent interview with Elon Musk where he said something, "My mind is a storm. I don't think most people would want to be me.
Right.
They may think they would want to be me, but they don't. They don't know. They don't understand." What do you think of that? Elon's someone that people probably look up to and admire and aspire to be.
One of the downsides to high-level genius is you might describe it as hypomania. So here's a simple test that people can do. So this is a test of something called verbal fluency, and verbal fluency is associated with creativity. And so here's a simple verbal fluency test. Write down as many four-letter words as you can in 3 minutes that begin with T. Okay, that's pretty constrained, 4 letters and T. Or write down as many words as you can in 3 minutes that begin with S. That's less constrained. All right, so there's quite a powerful correlation between the sheer number of words that you produce and your lifetime creative achievement, right? Especially in the artistic and verbal domains. That's different than vocabulary. Vocabulary is how many words you understand. Fluency is how many words you can produce in a given amount of
Deployment
time.
of those words. Yeah.
Well, people vary to a degree that you can hardly imagine. So some people, if you get them to do the 4-letter test in 3 minutes, they'll write down like 12 words. And some will write down 150. And the ones who are writing down 150, their minds are going at a hypomanic rate. They're
Yes. I'm not letting you guys arrest me right now. That's why I posted and said I'm not suicidal and not gonna hurt anybody. I'm not letting you guys do this. Respectfully, you see me, I'm saying. That's fine. Can I grab my stuff? Yeah. My stuff's over there. I'll walk to the car. I'm not getting arrested though. I'm telling you that right now. I'm safe. I'm fit to be here. My eyes are completely clear. Check my toxicology report. I'm on 0 drugs. Yeah, I'm good. Cops are coming to arrest me. Yeah, Cyborg, Lucy, Yusuf, it's called doxing. You ever heard of doxing? I'm totally okay. I'm an internet star. Yeah. People call the cops on me.
Alright, y'all, it's almost 7. About to get off stream.